Welcome in to our first special report for the New York Liberty. I'm Julia Moss, joined along with Miles Grossman. And Miles, it has been a crazy season. Obviously, this was par for the course when you get a roster like this. And I can't believe this is really our first time sitting down and discussing the season so far.
It is. It's been a good year so far. I mean, I think, we all knew how different the expectations would be and how much more pressure there is. And I think so far the Liberty have done a good job of balancing everything they have to balance, and Breanna Stewart has lived up to every expectation possible so far. A true MVP candidate through 25% of the season, and it's been a fun team to watch.
Absolutely, and you mentioned Breanna Stewart, and we're gonna start, maybe not on that track of MVP talk because we're gonna go over the Liberty versus Dream first, and then we'll go over their recent game against the Mercury, and then we're gonna look ahead to what we've seen so far, what we've liked, what we haven't liked. But let's start with the Dream, and prefacing it, Breanna Stewart is an MVP candidate, and she is incredible. But man, she had a career worst game against the Dream in that loss, 86-79, in a game where I really think the Liberty needed her more than ever because Sabrina Ionescu out with a precautionary, Sandy Brondello says, left hamstring injury. But my biggest takeaway was the fact Breanna Stewart can have an awful game, career worst game, and still get a double-double. Still had 12 points, 13 rebounds, 10 of those points coming from the free throw line. She was 1 for 14 from the field, 0 for 5 from 3-point, but as I said before, 10 for 12 from free throw. What were your takeaways from that aspect of that game?
Yeah, I mean, Breanna Stewart is a one-of-a-kind player, right? 6'4", 7'1" wingspan, can do it on both sides. I think, what was the biggest takeaway about Breanna Stewart's off night was that she still did it on the defensive end, right? I think It was 4 blocks and a steal on that side, and, not to mention the double-double, but Breanna Stewart is a player that is an aggressive shooter, right? So I think there's always the possibility of your shot not being with you that day. And that happens. It can, wear on you mentally once it starts to get going. And I think in Atlanta's case, they were really able to pressure Breanna Stewart, right? They were recognized that, hey, no Sab, we can really recognize Stewart as the number one threat. They did so, applied a lot of pressure, and, Breanna Stewart really didn't adjust, which was so rare because we see, whatever defense is thrown at her, she's always able to adjust and turn it around at least some point, and it never came. And I think, with no Sab, Stewie had a large load, and it didn't come through for them. But I think this is really more of a fluke than anything, because when you have an MVP candidate go 1 for 14, your team is not going to be the same, especially when your arguably number 3 option is out as well. But I don't see this as something that's going to derail Breanna Stewart's year nor the Liberty's year moving forward.
Absolutely. And another thing that I took away from that is the confidence from the coaching staff, even when she is having, a bit of a shooting slump. Still played 36 minutes, led the team in minutes in that game. So fully giving her the green light to shoot out of it. Unfortunately, it didn't work for her that game, but some positive takeaways from this game is, first of all, the fact they only lost by 7, and they were in it pretty much up until the end, and they had Sabrina out. Breanna Stewart might as well not have been on the court for much of it on the offensive end, of course. And players like Benijah Laney and Marine Johannes really stepped up, and they have been consistently, in my opinion, especially Marine Johannes back from France, and that's a really good sign. And Steph Dolson had a good first quarter. We mentioned how, she'd been shooting pretty well, got a 3 in there. But really, it comes down to something that has been an issue with or without Sabrina, with or without Breanna Stewart's shooting, and that's rebounding.
Mm-hmm.
Rebounding has been an issue this whole season. Atlanta had 42 rebounds. The Liberty had 33, and I really think that is kind of what made the difference, along with Atlanta's bench.
Absolutely, and you touched on it already, Julia, but it's not just rebounding, giving up offensive rebounds. That can be heartbreaking, right? You have a stellar defensive possession, and then you're not able to wrap it up by grabbing the board. And obviously, not only is that demoralizing, that emotional, that mental aspect, but it's also, it can totally turn over a game just getting those quick putbacks just with the pace of them, right? And I think, there's a case to be made, as I like to say, that giving up an offensive board is just as good as turning the ball over, right? It's a whole entire another possession for Atlanta. And I think there was a point early, it was in the second quarter, it was an 11-point differential in the offensive rebounding column. And I think, 11 offensive rebounds more than you're grabbing, that's just as good as a handful of turnovers, to say the very least, if not the full 11. So I think, they weren't able to get out of their own way, and that's been, if they had an Achilles heel this year, it would be that. Unable to wrap up possessions by grabbing defensive rebounds. But, it's Jonquel Jones still kind of finding her footing conditioning-wise, et cetera. And I think by the end of the year, once Jonquel is hopefully more, back to her normal self, that down low, that interior presence of the Liberty will be a tad stronger.
Absolutely. And then moving over to the Liberty versus Mercury just yesterday, something that happened before the game, it was announced that the Liberty were going to sign Epiphany Prince to a hardship contract, likely in the absence of Sabrina Ionescu. And, her performance definitely left some to be desired. But to kind of be devil's advocate here, you get signed out of, almost out of nowhere. This signing doesn't happen if Sabrina Ionescu isn't out. So to get thrown in that position, get 10 minutes in the game, which is, quite a lot for someone who was just signed, that day before. But it still wasn't great. She went 0 for 3 from the field, played 10 minutes. Not great.
And Piff Prince's minutes, it wasn't really what shows up on the stat sheet that bothered me. I think there were a couple times where she was seen as the point guard, right? She was really running the one, and a handful of those possessions just looked straight up stagnant, out of sync with their teammates, right? I remember Sloot was out on the right wing. It was Piff up top, and they were just back and forth. Neither was able to make a decision about how to get this offensive possession started, passed it back, turned it over. Brondello immediately calls a timeout, right? And I think Prince's play stood out in the wrong way this time, but I think her situation really speaks to like a larger issue in the W about how vets who are not necessarily rotation players don't have a spot in the league. Just because there's only 12 teams, and 12 times 12 is not that many spots. And I think it's difficult, for a player like Piff, because she's a veteran and she absolutely could add value to this Liberty team, but she's not given a genuine opportunity to do so, right? In and out of the franchise, not in and out of the lineup, in and out of the day-to-day operations of the team. It can be extremely difficult to just say, hey, come back. I'm sure there is that conversation between the coaching staff, the front office, and her saying, stay ready. You are our number one option. If things happen, we want to get you on the hardship deal. Obviously, she's been with the franchise for many years. She's a Fort Greene native. I think that they like her for a number of reasons, but it's difficult to see her in this spot because she deserves a more genuine opportunity than what she's getting. And obviously, once Sab is back, what's going to happen? She's not going to be on this team any longer. And I think, that's not really fair to have that carrot dangled. I mean, but you talk about fairness and athletic opportunity. That's a whole different conversation. I mean, it's just a competitive game, but it's difficult to watch because, she stood out in a really bad way. She didn't look in sync with her teammates, and I don't really think you can blame her very much.
Exactly. And you bring up a really great point that, I've talked about with so many people, and that is the current state of the league, because there's such a disproportionate amount between, the interest in the league versus the amount of talent that is allowed in the league. Because as you mentioned, 12 players on 12 teams, you do the math. 144 players is not enough for a successful league, because not only do you have veterans who can't have their feet wet in a franchise, much like Piff Prince is going through right now, but also you can't really develop talent. You don't have room to develop talent in this league where there's only 12 players on a team. There's only 12 teams. There's so many stories when you look at teams in the NBA or even like the NFL where it's like, even someone, I don't know an example, but there's quarterbacks all the time that are in the NFL that really don't get to play until 4 or 5 years into their. You look at Aaron Rodgers, even didn't play for the first few years. Tom Brady, Tom Brady's perfect example. That could never happen in the WNBA because there's not the room to develop. If you're not hitting it right away from the draft, God forbid you're drafted outside of the top 10 picks, you have not only do you have no room to develop. If you show weakness, you will likely be cut. We see this, first overall picks from less than 4 years ago are getting cut in today's league. And again, if you're drafted in the second round, your chance of making the league is just slim to none.
Yeah, and I guess the opportunity to climb back to the WNBA spot is overseas. That's what that that's what the WNBA would claim. But I think it is difficult, and I think it brings up the conversation of what is the right direction for expansion. Is kind of a, I don't know, maybe a waiver team or something of that, where it's you have practice squad spots within the franchise rather than expansion, because I think that's the popular solution, saying, hey, let's just tack on 2 more cities, 24 more spots. But I think that it's difficult because in a perfect world, you could make possibly a 2-way situation. I think, you could have that G League equivalent, right? Or maybe not even, full scale. Right. But you have a couple and you have them in a training camp type situation. You can keep them on board. But I think, the current CBA and the current status of the league is really dependent on this let's even the playing field situation, where you have certain owners who would be clearly willing to invest more than others. And so you have to make sure that the teams that don't have the billionaire owners are not punished. So it's difficult to move forward because you almost have to create an even playing field across owners, where you say everyone's willing to invest, so then now we can actually take these steps within our own franchises instead of look elsewhere with expansion.
And I've said this before when talking about the Liberty. It's kind of confusing to me because you mentioned the league expansion is the popular option for a lot of people. 24, and I know it's not as simple as it seems, but it's not simple for any league, and we see every other league, even women's leagues, expanding at a much higher rate. You look at the NWSL, who had, I think, 12 teams like 3 years ago, and now they're like moving up to 16. And it seems like every season it's 2 more teams, 2 more teams, 2 more teams, and it's thriving. These teams, you see Angel City FC in the NWSL has incredible attendance. Celebrities everywhere are flocking to invest in this. And same thing with San Diego. And these are 2 expansion teams that they just released. You can't even imagine what the WNBA expansion team would look like, because there is so much. The NWSL doesn't exactly have tons of people like expand, but the WNBA does. So you've got to think, if they expand to another team, that support in that area would be so intensified because of how many people across the United States and even probably beyond want this league to be expanded.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt there's a lot of, women's basketball as a whole coming off the NCAA tournament is probably, picking up momentum in a way that it hasn't ever before. So I think, there will be WNBA expansion on the way, and in my opinion, I don't think that expansion teams-wise is necessarily the quickest way to a higher quality product. I think it would rather be, expansion within each particular franchise. Maybe you open up 3 practice squad type 2-way contract spots, so players like Bree Beal are still on these teams. So players like Prince can play a role as that veteran minimum Udonis Haslem type, things
at least
like
with their
that.
team.
At least with their team, right? I don't think that that's that far fetched either. That there's the it just seems like a realistic path to getting some more footing in depth within franchises.
The budget can't be that small to where you can't open it up 2 or 3 practice squad players. I couldn't agree with you more, Miles, on that. But moving back into the actual product being played on the court, Liberty versus Mercury, a huge issue with the Liberty versus Dream was bench scoring, but, we saw that kind of turn up on its head a little bit in this game. The bench really came up big. And the Liberty led the entire game. I think that's a really interesting stat. You didn't let up at all, really rode their first quarter domination. The scoring was pretty even for the third and fourth quarter, but, they played such a strong first half, it didn't matter.
Yeah, it was the 30-point first quarter. I think it was. They were hitting on all cylinders early, right? Stewie was super aggressive. It seemed like it was a bit of a get-right game for her. She knew she was coming off that 1 for 14. She had 4 days to sit on it and say, how am I going to change? And I think, I remember watching that first Stewie shot fall, and I bet less than 90 seconds in, and it was like, okay, now she's back. She's back to her normal herself. And I think, it was 15. It was something around 27 through 3, I think it was, or it was, Stewie got off to that start that you expected her to. And I think the Liberty never really looked back after that. And Sandy Brondello, once this one got out of hand, she was very quick to turn to the subs. And I think she said in her post-game press conference they've earned it in practice. They've looked a hell of a lot better as a unit. And I think that showed. Willoughby knocked down a couple shots, which was really nice to see because she's someone who really deserves that opportunity in the league. So it felt good. But you're right. Down the stretch, even in the first quarter, I think it was the final 3 minutes of the first quarter, was a full bench 5. A full reserve 5 in the first quarter is not something you will ever see unless you're in control of a ball game. And the Liberty were in control, and I think in the third quarter, they came out flat. I think it was 4 points through the first 4 minutes of the third, and then the Phoenix was able to close the gap a little bit. But even following that, never within range. Liberty controlled wire to wire, but and I think one of the biggest takeaways is the bench just getting an opportunity to get comfortable because early on the bench was not strong, and I think you had a couple moments where you didn't know who was a reliable bench player to turn to, where you weren't particularly content with the ball being in I don't know, even X hands. I don't want to say any particular names, but I think coming off this one, you have more faith in the second unit simply because they've had more time to gel, and that blowout will provide the opportunity.
100%. And just a couple other takeaways for me. I think Dolson had another solid game, 3 for 3, 6 points, 4 rebounds in only 16 minutes. She's had a pretty terrible start to the season, but seems to be turning it around in her minutes, and hopefully that continues because, it's a tough position for Steph Dolson. She's so committed to this team, and all praise to her for that. But, when you have a team come together in this way where there's so much talent coming in, Dolson, I think, has gotten the worst of it in terms of taking a backseat in her role.
Absolutely. And I think, particularly with a young player in Sabali, it looked early like Dolson was really just going to lose her rotation spot entirely to a young name in Sabali. And now that, she has a solid game against Phoenix, 17 minutes as opposed to Sabali's 8, I think, Sandy will be less likely to turn to away from Dolson down the stretch. But, you're exactly right. She was a player a few years ago where Stephanie Dolson was a top name in this league.
Yeah.
When the New York Liberty acquired her, it felt like she was going to be part of the core moving forward. And obviously now just a regular part of this reserve rotation that can't be that easily mentally.
Yeah, but, really picking it up down the stretch here. And it's still an early season. I think we've talked so much about New York Liberty that it feels like, we've played so much basketball, but there's still so much left to be played. And with that being said, looking ahead, they play the Dream again, assuming Sabrina Ionescu comes back from that precautionary, Sandy Brondello says, left hamstring, the full rotation will be back. Breanna Stewart, has a good game to put that god-awful game behind her that she had before. And this is a completely different team, in my opinion, playing this Dream, given they are playing at Atlanta, but I don't see another loss for them.
I'd be absolutely shocked with another loss, but there's no doubt that the Dream will challenge the Liberty on the boards. The same way that they killed the Liberty on the offensive glass, they will really put up a tough number on the offensive boards. And I think if the Liberty aren't able to kind of assert a more physical presence down low, it's going to be a tight one because Atlanta's not going anywhere. And I think, even with Sab out with a precautionary issue, I think, they're going to be so careful at this point in the year, right? 25% into the year, you're 7-3, you're sitting pretty, or there's no need to necessarily bring Sabrina back and rush things whatsoever, especially when you have so many weapons around her. So I think it would be a tad surprising not to see a return just because they did label it precautionary, but nothing would shock me with this team anymore because I think more than anyone they recognize how these games are really just preparing for later in the year, and they're not gonna rush anything. But if the Liberty do dominate, it'll have to come on preventing offensive boards.
Yep, 100%. You pretty much hit the nail on the head with everything. I think Jonquel Jones is going to have to step up a little bit on the boards because of how aggressive Atlanta attacks the glass on the offensive end. Breanna Stewart had a really good defensive game the last time out if she can put the offense together, while also continuing to be dominant under the boards. That's going to be huge. But yeah, the Liberty, the Dream rather, I think their record is not adequate on how good they really are. And this could be a close game. I would be surprised with the loss, just given everything seems to be coming together. The Sabrina Ionescu thing, I think, is a real question mark, because you have to think we don't really know like how precautionary it really is. And as you just said, it's like, if there's any chance that she could have a re-injury at this point in the season, no reason to play her. So should be interesting to see, one, if she starts, two, how many minutes she gets. I think that would be a huge determinant on how close this game is. But that kind of wraps up the game part of it. I'm going to close it out here, Miles. We'll each give our one thing, but what's one thing you want them to really focus on and get better at? And then what is one thing you think they've done really well so far as we're 25% into the season?
Get better at is surely wrapping up possessions, right? Grabbing defensive rebounds and not allowing second chance points, which can be such a backbreaker. I mean, if the Liberty were able to grab a couple defensive rebounds throughout this first 10-game stretch, they'd be just a different ball club. And I think, you're happy with this 7-3 start, because these first 10 games were where the question marks were. How is this team going to gel together? They've had a couple injuries, right? Jonquel, not 100% yet. Sabrina, clearly not 100%. But I think you're happy with the 7-3, and you're saying, I can see the writing on the wall. Once we get a couple more defensive rebounds and we're able to finish off possessions, we're going to be that top caliber ball club.
Yep. And for me, what they have to work on has got to be rebounding. That's, Jonquel Jones needs to, not necessarily needs to step up, because she's coming back from, being out for quite a while. But as she starts to progress, I think we're going to see those maybe defensive woes start to patch themselves up. But as far as things that I've liked, unselfish basketball has got to be number one, considering this roster. There's so many point getters from different teams that have come together on this one team, but yet they lead the league in assists, which I think is huge for the offensive success they've had. They're top 5 in points. Top 5 in field goal percentage, actually third in that. They shoot a lot of threes and they make a lot of threes. So overall offense has just top to bottom been really great. But the one thing that stands out has got to be, that assist number per game. But that is going to wrap up our special Liberty Report. We'll be doing this a lot more often from this point going forward. But thank you so much for listening. This has been a production of WFUV Sports.